Good afternoon, everyone. Glad to see you all here. I'm David Regal. You may have seen an email from me. Just sort of the informal volunteer coordinator of this effort for Claremont Fancourt School. But I'm here simply to introduce Jane Jenkins, the school's bursar, who is here to greet you officially. And Jane, please. Thank you.
A warm welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining us here today at Claremont. This is the third in a series of talks about gardens and landscape history that we've held here. This site has an important history, as I'm sure you know, and through working on its master plan and landscape management plan, we have learnt just what it means to own and manage such an estate. We're very fortunate to have an effective advisory team here to help us with these challenges. I have the privilege of being the bursar here, and in this role I've worked with a number of experts on heritage and landscape. We hope that these talks will both promote and extend the conversation about what these important landscapes are for. That is, how they can be conserved whilst remaining relevant to our modern world. We're grateful to the National Trust and the Garden History Society for their help in promoting today's event, and also to David Regal, also a landscape architect from across the Atlantic, whose idea these talks were. We're pleased to welcome our speakers here today. Dominic Cole, landscape architect, a distinguished name in the business, well known for his expertise and experience in historic parks and gardens and heritage landscapes. Next to him is Chris Churchman. Chris is also an experienced landscape architect. He has prepared the landscape management plan for this school. Dr. Kate Fellis, garden historian who specialises in the social use of historic designed landscapes and garden buildings, and also has a deep interest in Charles Bridgman. Kate also teaches and lectures on garden history and conservation. And next to Kate is Mike Phillips. Mike Phillips is an architect with a close interest in local history here in Esher, and he's also a member of our advisory team for the school's master plan. So I'll hand over to you now to start.
The way we're going. Is it open? Okay. The way this is does not need to be a formal discussion. It wants to be a conversation, and you're all invited to take part, but the way we're going to lead off is having each of our panelists take just a moment to discuss their work in particular, just a few moments to introduce you to them through their work. And I'm standing here sort of, I hate to call it a moderation or a moderator. I'm not looking for moderation, but I will be fiddling with the computer and trying to make slides happen on the screen for you. Who wants to go first? How about Mike, since he's at the end? Do you want to just give us a little? You want the other end could go too.
Briefly, I'm a qualified architect, work in Richmond. I'm also chairman of the Esher Conservation Area Advisory Committee, whose remit has recently been extended to include Lakeside Drive, being made a conservation area. I've had a long association with Claremont going back, I think about 35 years, when I worked with a conservation architect called Gilbert Williams. And I hadn't intended at all to go into that branch of architecture. But I spent 4 years working on both Claremont and a number of National Trust properties. including the early stages of Paynes Hill Park, which you'll probably all know down the road at Cobham. If we can just slip through the slides. I took these photos this morning. I was quite proud that Lakeside Drive has been made a conservation area. It's a group of, I think, about 16 houses built in the 1970s by Royston Summers in a contemporary style, which owes a lot to my all-time favourite architect, who's Louis Kahn, an American architect. And it's a group, if you don't know it, it's set around a beautiful landscape lake, which was originally the lake to Milbourne House. So we can have a run through a series of slides here. So next one. And this gives an idea of what the houses are like. And it's now a mature setting. But some of them are so authentic that they're now used in films. And I think the last time they were used was for the film about the racing driver James Hunt. So next. I just took a set of photos this morning to give you an idea of what the place is like if you don't know it. But what I really like about it is it's a beautiful integration of planting, walls and buildings, rather than a building being an object in a landscape. It's all knitted together, and there's surprises as you go through the landscape. And I'm sure this is what the original architect intended it to look like. And when you think how many buildings from the 1970s now look fairly tawdry and ropey, this has survived really well.
Sorry, would you be able to speak up a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I'm drifting away from the microphone. Next. That's just a close-up of the edge of the pond, which a few daffs coming out there. Next. Moving on to conservation, I think a lot of the problems and issues that are faced by gardens are also faced by buildings. This is a house in Marlborough on the green. It's a beautiful stone house. But if you show the next slide, it will show the kind of problem that we get where beautiful old buildings or landscapes have been somehow mistreated or misunderstood and badly extended, and which then leaves us with the process of working with them to try and restore them and give them a viable new use. But I think what it illustrates is that there's very often a lack of knowledge at that early stage when people have done work. If you have the next slide. This is going from a rather grand house to a very small house, which my wife and I own. It's on the island of Portland, which is where a lot of the stone in London comes from, including St Paul's Cathedral. And that's how it was when we bought it. And it illustrates a lot of the problems which we get with small buildings. I worked for a while as a conservation consultant to Elmbridge, and people want to do the right thing, but very often there's a lack of real knowledge about what they ought to be doing. The big problem here was that this terrace had all been pointed using cement, Portland cement mortar rather than lime mortar, so that all had to be taken out. It was full of asbestos, and it had a terrible dormer that had just been plonked on the roof. So if you've got the next slide, to show and that's how it sort of ended up. But unfortunately, the rest of the terrace is still pretty awful. The next slide. This is some of my own work. A lot of our work is in historic towns and knitting new buildings in rather than the whole-scale sort of flattening and destruction. And this is in Ringwood in the New Forest. The next slide. And this just shows the grey buildings are existing and the new ones are where we're knitting in housing and small shops around existing pubs and so on. So I just thought I'd put that in. Next slide. This is a project I worked on with Chris Churchman's company. And it's a very difficult site in Guildford overlooking St Martha's Hill. And we designed a house for the chief executive officer of Unilever, and there was another landscape architect involved who remained nameless, and they didn't really take into account the slope, and bearing in mind it's about a 30-degree hill, it sort of led to all sorts of problems. So got Chris involved, and they did an absolutely fantastic job, and it's really turned out very well, and the clients are happy, and they're still talking to me, which is always a test. Next slide, please. This is another project where we work with Andy Thornhill from Chris's office, and this is a modern house in Leatherhead. And Andy was very clever. They had an awful, what they called a breeze house, which was like a woman's grass skirt, you know, and he managed to push it out to the left so that we could take some nice photos without it being seen. So they're not here today. Next slide. This is a Waitrose in Winchester, which we work with Chris on, which fills a corner and is interesting in the way that it's not just a supermarket. There's a health centre on top and housing, so it's making better use of land. And unlike a lot of supermarkets, it's not a sea of car parking in front of it. The car parking's all underneath, so that the buildings create the townscape, which I think is, bearing in mind how precious land is, I think a lot of supermarkets squander space, and if we can get cars down below, that's a good thing. Next slide. It's another project I'm working on with Chris, which is Rustington Convalescent Home, which is, as it says, a convalescent home, and we're building some market housing within the grounds to help support the convalescent home use and keep that running. It's actually subsidised and owned by the Worshipful Company of Carpenters. Next slide. I've got a few slides which kind of illustrate something which might come up in our discussions, which is to do with some of the problems facing landscapes, and one is, rather than is to do with the number of people visiting some properties, and this is Richmond Green, which is absolutely sort of gets packed up with that, you know, can create its own problems. Next slide. The other thing is climate change, and this is Esher Green with a bit of water on it. I think that's, being Esher, that's a Porsche over at the far end next to the van. See. Next slide. This is moving on to a different subject. This is actually the M25, and it's probably the last thing you'd expect to see on an afternoon like this. And it's there for two reasons. One is the kind of things that can affect a landscape can be not just physical, it can be sound. And if you step outside of Claremont House some days, you can really hear the A3, which is six lanes of traffic. And to my mind, there is not enough care or thought given into the placement of infrastructure, and that's certainly very topical at the moment with HS2. The other thing I wanted to say was that there's a very good book called London Orbital by Ian Sinclair, which is all about a walk around the M25, which is, again, another way of thinking and talking and engaging with landscape. It's a very, very entertaining and amusing book, but it's well worth a read. It's sort of psychogeography, which is bringing literature into landscape, which is nice. Next slide. Oops. This is the landscape at King's Cross, which is a recovered landscape, I guess you'd call it. It's one of my favourites, where the new St Martin's College is, and I think it's turning out very well. We had an office trip there, and again, it's an urban landscape, but it's sort of well worth a visit. Next slide. This is bringing art into landscape. This was a project that was at Ham House, where a group of artists were invited to respond to the place. And again, this might come up in our conversation, but I view new forms of engagement with landscape that isn't purely to do with a dry kind of account of what it is, but more to do with a cultural response to the place as being very interesting. And these balloons, which look a bit like something from The Prisoner, actually reflect the patterns of tiles within the house, and they bob up and down when the wind gets going, so it's sort of kinetic. But it just, you see them, you just think, well, what's going on? Next slide. This was part of the same exhibition, which was to do with optics and measurement across the grounds. And if you know Ham House, it's a very geometric arrangement with lots of long diagonals. And these optics were set up, and you look down them and see people in the distance upside down, which is really good fun for children. Next. It's the maze at Hampton Court. The Grey organisation did a sound piece there, and it varies, the maze at Hampton Court. It can be good, and then it can sometimes, some years it can be really moth-eaten, and it can be a bit of a dull experience. It's sort of railings all around it. When they had this soundscape in, it was absolutely magical. It was a real sort of Alice in Wonderland sort of experience with sort of people, bits of narrative coming through. So I think that's, again, ways of engaging with, non-intrusive ways of engaging with historic landscape, which can be quite interesting and bring other groups in. Next. This is a building called the Rusty Bucket down in, by Thomas Heatherwick down at, it's called the East Beach Cafe, it's at Littlehampton. And I took it as an abstract photo because I wanted to see whether people could guess what it was. But it's interesting the way modern objects, almost sculptural buildings, are becoming part of a new landscape. Further along the coast, there's a sort of something that looks like a handrail that's had one too many drinks and gone on a big walk, and it's sort of I don't know what it's called. Do you know?
The long bench.
The long bench. That's right. A bench that's gone on the wall. Yeah. Which again is, it just sort of helps bring up the environment, and that kind of cultural engagement with places that have been, somewhat tired for a while is it brings new people in. Next. This is Kingswood near Ashford, which is a huge woodland inhabited with sculpture, and this is a massive sort of trumpet arrangement, and it's fed by a spring which drips down into a cavern, and the sounds are amplified, and the children just love it. And it's by Jim Firmer, I think, who was one of the Pogues. So from sort of completely reckless rock and roll person to somebody producing these beautiful landscape objects is quite a jump. Next. This is a nice use for an old building. It's the Ditchley Museum, Ditchley Museum of Art and Craft, which I just put in there because the landscaping has been done very nicely. It's sort of melded in some old farm buildings that have been added to. And again, I'd recommend a visit. Next. This is just sort of a tranquil photo to finish off with, so we can just sort of relax.
No relaxing.
Sorry.
Yes.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael.
I threw together some not terribly good photographs this morning of to give you 3 really tiny, weeny, potted case studies of some landscapes that I am working on at the moment. One project that we haven't quite got going yet, and one that we're just finishing, and one where we're going back to, just to think about in quite kind of simple terms, I suppose, the sustainability of landscapes. Before I'm conscious that picture's up there, and you probably want to know what it's all about, but I should just introduce myself. I'm Kate Fellish. I'm a historian by training. I have worked with historic landscapes since 1992, and I've been a freelance consultant for, I think, 12 years. So I come from a completely different perspective because I come from a historian's perspective. One of one of the sites we're working on at the moment is a very interesting site that you will never have heard of unless you happen to live south of Horsham in West Sussex. And it's a place called Sedgwick Park. And it's an incredibly rich site. It has the remains of a 12th century castle, which is probably unique in that it has these, this is not the greatest plan, but these two concentric moats. And we had some people out from English Heritage the other day, and they've never seen anything like it. And the moats are more or less dry, but they flow into these two ponds, which may have been fish ponds. It was probably on the edge of a medieval deer park. The castle went in the early 17th century. A new house was built slightly further up the hill, and the walls are about this high now. All the building stone was pinched from it, more or less. And it's a very, very funny site. It's incredibly rich in that it has this interesting and unique layout. It has 800 years of history. It has a possible remains of a holy well, which you can just see there. It then has an early 18th century small parkland and a very lovely late 19th century garden. Could we go on to the next slide, just to give you... I apologise for the quality of this, it's not very good, but just to give you a feeling of what's where. I can probably shout, if you don't want to hear me. The castle is here, you can just see the shape here. Main house up here, kitchen garden, bit of parkland. And if we go, can we go on? Just the next one. This is an extremely lovely, evocative 1880, or no, actually 1901 photograph from Country Life. This is this very interesting lady gardener called Emma Henderson, who was widowed at a relatively young age and just threw all her energy into creating garden after garden after garden at Sedgwick. And the degree of sort of detail in the garden here illustrates how much money there was in the estate at the time. She could afford to have almost limitless staff helping her in the gardens. If you go on to the last one, this is the sort of swan song of the estate in, I think this is from 1966 Hale catalogue. At this point, the estate started to get broken up. And this is one of the, well, this is the reason I want to use this as a case study. And I think this is the very hardest scenario that we face in trying to preserve and make sustainable historic gardens and buildings, is if there's fractured ownership, it becomes extremely, extremely difficult. So now the clients that we've been working for, they own the parkland that you can see running across just above the house on this view, and part of Castlewood with the castle inn. They own some really rather wonderful remnant coppice woodland as well, with a large colony of small leaf limes, which are really interesting. They've got mosses that have never been discovered in Sussex before. So it's a very, very rich site, and they've just sold off in the middle of their higher level scheme. They've just sold off these really interesting woodlands. But the point is that the parkland and the woodland, it was part of the economy of the estate. It was part of what sustained the estate. And now the money coming into the estate, the owner made their money in the city in selling insurance. So the sort of agricultural landscape and the forestry isn't needed. And this is an estate that's in real trouble. There's been development up in the sort of top right-hand corner. There are new houses built, which subsequent to this, the kitchen garden has almost gone. Along this edge, this line here, it was almost quarter of a mile of yew hedges and iris borders. Nobody's going to unless they have Emma Henderson, the lady in white from the last picture, unless they have that sort of resource, nobody is going to keep those things going anymore. So this is quite a sad state. I'm conscious that we could dwell on this, but just bear that in mind. Can we go on to the next? So this is a second kind of potted case study. This is Mount Edgecombe in Cornwall on the southwest side of Plymouth Sound. So this is Plymouth in the centre, and Mount Edgecombe is the lump on the right-hand side. So here's the house, and this is Maple Church up here. So this is a very early view of it. The landscape here became extended throughout the 18th century and into the early 19th century. And it was laid out in the English landscape style with coastal drives running for 4 or 5 miles along the cliffs, which are not quite so precipitous as they're shown in this view. It's an incredibly, incredibly magical place. It's one of only 2 Grade 1 landscapes in Cornwall, and I think is one of the best landscapes in the southwest and should be much, much better known. But it belongs jointly to Cornwall County Council and Plymouth City Council. So you have a completely different setup from Sedgwick, which is in fractured but private ownership. Here you have a municipal ownership. And they have 56 listed buildings. In the I think it was 1970s, and Dominic knows Mount Edgecombe as well, so he'll correct me if I'm wrong, the Earl of Mount Edgecombe gave Plymouth City Council and Cornwall County Council the house and the park, the gardens, and all the listed buildings, and kept all the agricultural land very sensibly. Here, have my liabilities. And the staff who are there have made amazing efforts, and they've done some restoration, and it looks pretty good, actually. But they are, like all local authority funded places, they are facing severe cuts in their budgets. And because they have 2 owners, every time one owner decides that they're going to cut their budget, the other owner has to cut it by the same amount. So if Cornwall decide they're going to cut it by £50,000, suddenly they lose £100,000 of their budget. And that has actually happened. So they are looking at various options at the moment. And one thing that they're doing, which I think is very interesting, and I think is a really good use of buildings, is they're looking at their residential buildings or their lodges, of which they have quite a lot, and they're seeking to turn them into holiday cottages, which is brilliant because A, they're in a really good location, B, it allows you a degree of public access, and C, it gives you a use for the building. And what I really like, I was saying to David yesterday, what I really like about it is the idea that you can not only go and visit Mount Edgecombe and stay there, but you can also go to Plymouth without having to negotiate the really scary traffic system and car parks and roads and all that sort of thing. You can just get on the boat from Mount Edgecombe and be in this amazing historic city. So can we go on to the next? This just to give you, this is Mount Edgecombe the day before yesterday, and Plymouth in the background. You can see highlighted by the particularly attractive tower blocks. And I think under the circumstances they do a pretty good job there. These upper gardens were immaculately maintained. The outer areas are less so, but it's such a huge site. There's almost sort of size fatigue. Shall we go on? And so this is just to give an idea of these coastal drives. I was standing just off one of the coastal drives, and by this point possibly 1 mile, 2 miles from the house, and it carries on along the right-hand side of this view, down into the villages of Kingsand and Corsand, and all the way to the headland on the left, and in fact beyond. So and most of that is still country park. So that's it is huge. Okay, next. So this is I've this morning was frantically trying to find a slightly better photograph of this. Is Pentilly Castle in Cornwall, and this is, I think, a great success story. Some of you may have seen it on Country House Rescue a few years ago. How does one summarise it very quickly? It was inherited about 5 or 6 years ago by somebody who had he inherited it from his cousin. He'd been living on the estate and managing the agricultural land. it was inherited under very strange and difficult circumstances. The house and the immediate landscape had been shut up for about 20 years by the cousin of the man who's inherited its wife, or his widow, and nobody even went down the drive. Anyway, Ted Corriton, who owns it, and his wife Sarah and his daughter Sammy have turned the place. It was too painful for them to want to live there. So they have turned it into a very upmarket bed and breakfast. They do weddings and they do conferences. They do pop-up restaurants. They do open-air theatre, you name it, really. Any activity that goes on in country houses, any commercial activity, they do it. And they do it extremely, extremely well. And I'd like to be able to say it's starting to pay for itself, but the death duties that they had to pay were so absolutely enormous. It's paying for the death duties. But they also had a large grant from Natural England to restore some of their buildings, the kitchen garden, some of the garden walls that date from the late 17th century, and the mausoleum, could we have the next slide, which is probably the first garden mausoleum in the country and predates the very famous one at Castle Howard by at least 20 years. There's another long story about this, but I could be here all day talking to you about Pentilly. But I think Pentilly is a very good success story, but partly because it's not in divided ownership. It's in the hands of one family who are incredibly committed to it. And something that we came up in the discussions that we had by email before this was the importance of personality. I think the people who run the place, they're passionate about it, and they're also very good at talking to people and sharing their passion. And that's one of the things that gets people going back to Pentilly again and again, be it for bed and breakfast, be it booking their wedding there, or be it just going for a snowdrop walk or a bluebell walk. And people also like to watch progress on places, and Pentilly's been a great project for that. So that's my kind of third. I don't know whether there's one. I think there's one more. This is a view from just behind the mausoleum, just to show you quite how magical the setting is. The house. The house is just about here. This is. I should have said this is. It's set in the Tamar Valley. On the Cornwall side of the Tamar Valley, and you're looking at Dartmoor in the background. It has many blessings. So my kind of potted history is ending on my potted case studies are ending on a real positive site. So that's me to kick off with.
Thank you, Kate.
We're going to put I was going to ask David to put the landscape management plan up for Claremont. I'm not going to talk to this particular document. I'm afraid I haven't come with slides, visuals of schemes that we've built or designed. But this particular document, if I can ask you just to sort of page turn through it, and I'll sort of speak over it. So if you get bored with my speaking, then at least you can look at the sort of visuals on the screen. I should start off by saying that this afternoon really sort of takes me back 40 years, because Dominic and I were in the same year at college, so this is the first time I think we've actually sat next to each other for 40 years. After college, our sort of careers went down very different routes, and I understand that Dominic is now either retired or semi-retired, certainly, or certainly in the consultancy role. I'm still actively running my own practice, and will continue doing so for the next 10 years, so I'll let you read into that what you will. So I suppose I come at this with a slightly different perspective again. Obviously, I'm not an architect. I'm neither a landscape historian. Certainly Kate and Dominic have much greater knowledge and experience in terms of historic landscapes, or certainly in the analysis of historic landscapes than I do. But we do come at this with some sort of pedigree. So over the last, I've run my own practice now for 20 years, been a landscape architect for 35 years. So I suppose the first time I really dabbled with historic landscapes in a big way was at Stonehenge in the sort of mid-90s. And at that time, 20 years ago, I was still unfettered by reality. And so the ideas that we were coming up with at that time in terms of how you interpret historic landscapes are actually now coming to fruition. I don't know how many of you are aware, but the new visitor centre has now been opened up at Stonehenge, A lot of the ideas that we were looking at, particularly in terms of use of mobile phones to actually disseminate information to people so that you can sort of draw into or dig into detail about historic artifacts at whatever level you want to as you walk around a site, sort of getting information from an app basically over your mobile phone. Those sort of ideas were things we were thinking about 15 years ago, and they have now sort of come to fruition. That was a sort of competition submission that we did for the Stonehenge, but in terms of a scheme that actually was built, Tower of London was the first thing that I really worked on, where a historic site of sort of international significance, World Heritage status, a new landscape was delivered, and we worked with Stanton Williams, who delivered the new visitor plaza. So all of the sort of paving that runs down to the river was the sort of that was the sort of scheme that we were working on. And obviously, as soon as you start to delve into that sort of project as a designer, then you have to understand the historic fabric and the historic evolution of the site in order to deliver a new solution to it. I suppose those skills really sort of were carried forward when we worked on the National Maritime Museum at Greenwich. So some of you may know that particular project. So this is the back of the National Maritime Museum, which has now become the front. So the old frontage used to sort of face onto the Thames. The museum decided that they wanted to actually have their visitors arrive from Greenwich Park. And so the arrival space, the sort of public realm that went with that, and getting people from Greenwich Park, but also people who were walking from the town centre up to the Royal Observatory, to get them to actually come into the museum as visitors, that was very much a sort of landscape-led exercise. And so architects had been working on that particular scheme for a couple of years, trying to find solutions to how you might unlock that problem and get people actually to the front door of the museum. Everything they came up with, English Heritage were rejecting. And so after 2 years, they decided to go out to competition actually to choose landscape architect. We were successful in that process. And a key part of the delivery of that scheme was opening up a new route that's very much a sort of historic site. Obviously, it's World Heritage site, but a route which had never existed before. We felt that they had to sort of open up in order to connect the museum doors with the sort of main route that people were taking from the town centre up to the observatory. So that's all now completed. We've won various awards for that project, and which is obviously fantastic in itself. So I suppose that really sort of sparked the interest in historic landscapes, and so Claremont really was the first where we were looking in some depth at landscape evolution. I would say, just going back to Greenwich, I mean, I think we had learnt there that what one assumes to be a landscape or an architectural composition that it has one single date to it is almost certainly never the case. Greenwich, when you stand at the Wolf Monument by the Royal Observatory and look down towards the Thames, you think that whole sort of panorama is something that has one date to it. Well, that panorama was constructed over 300 years. It sort of started with the Queen's House, and then all of the other sort of wings, particularly Wren's Naval College going down towards the river, they were built over a very extended period. The last buildings were going up start of the 1900s. So that sort of classic panorama that, probably the most famous panorama in London, that is something that wasn't conceived by one person. It was very much a sort of collaborative effort. And I think in a way there's something quintessentially English about the way that we do these grand gestures on a sort of piecemeal basis. And it very much applies here at Claremont as well. If you look at what happened here, that the landscape, when it was at its peak, when Brown finished in the sort of back end of the 1700s, there were 3 or 4 other landscapes which went before that, all markedly different. So within a 100-year period, there were effectively 4 or 5 makeovers of the landscape, and that sort of process continued throughout the 1800s, when obviously the royalty were in residence, and similarly through the 1900s. So that sort of process of producing a landscape is a sort of evolutionary process which is ongoing even now. So I suppose for us, when we started working on this, actually, David, if you could just keep running through the pages, yeah. And I mean, obviously, don't stop on the writing, but there are sort of plans in there which people might find more interesting. I think when we were approached to work on this at Claremont, I mean, obviously, it's a fantastic opportunity. You know, I mean, if you just got to read through the sort of document, the historic facts to realise, you know, the sort of status of the place, the fact that you have Vanbrugh, then Bridgeman, Kent, Brown, followed by royalty, sort of Charlotte, Leopold, Queen Victoria. So that whole sort of 200-year period, you know, and the sort of clients who lived here during that period. So Newcastle, Clive of India, and then again, you know, the King of the Belgians. So that in itself is sort of fascinating. But I think also when one considers Claremont as a sort of the status of Claremont, you know, it is one of 150 Grade 1 listed landscapes in this country, so it has rarity value. And I think quite often that is people put different slants on that. I mean, one would assume that if you are one of the top 150, that puts you in the Premier League of landscapes, and so you know, protection of that historic landscape should be paramount. I think something that's been interesting for us is to learn that you know, people put a slightly different spin on that, and it isn't always the history must come first. I think Claremont also has some quite complex issues apart from its historic status, the fact that it's greenbelt, and the fact that it is where it is. You know, the fact that it's on the edge of London. I mean, I think that proximity to London has always been an issue, but obviously now that it's pretty much at the edge of suburban development, again, places real sort of pressures and real sort of conundrums, really, which need to be considered when you are looking at this sort of development. I think as a designer, you know, you do look at historic landscapes in a slightly different way to a historian, because I mean, as a landscape architect, I think you inevitably try and put yourself in the position of Capability, Brown or Kent. You know, what were they trying to do when they laid this out? I mean, I know what we have now is a sort of vestige of what they were playing with throughout the sort of 1700s. I mean, by the time Brown was delivering his landscape, there was 150 acres. That was his canvas. Now we're down to 36. So inevitably, there's a very different set of circumstances. But I think you can still start to think through the sort of processes that each of those designers must have gone through when they were working for very different clients. It's always a bit of a conundrum, or it's always a bit of a mystery to me what Brown thought about the relationship between the house and its position here and the Belvedere. Some people interpret that relationship and say it's a very strong one. I don't think that Brown really, or I have a feeling that maybe he didn't see it that way, because certainly there was no sort of overt expression in his design of the linkage between those two structures. So I think, yeah, you just inevitably start to look at, you know, why did people put things in these particular places, and how would they have done things? You know, if they were faced with current circumstances, how would they have done things differently? So I think that's given you hopefully a sort of introduction as to where I come from. If we do need to go through the landscape management plan later, obviously I think there's 160 pages in there, so there's obviously a lot of information that people can sort of delve into if they want to.
Great.
Thank you.
We'll look at some of these pages as we get into our discussion. Now, Nikki? Down it doesn't need slides.
No, it's simply I can't read instructions, so I didn't think I needed slides. So I don't have any. I'm Dominic Cole. I'm a landscape architect. I'm not retired. The confusion may be that I worked for a company called Land Use Consultants for 29 years. I left them 2.5 years ago, so I've been working on my own since then. But Chris is not the first person in the last few months to observe that I'm retired, so obviously I'm not doing something right. As well as running my own practice, I am chairman of the Garden History Society, which is one of the 10 or so amenity societies, and the Garden History Society is responsible for, is a statutory consultee in the planning process, so we actually employ professional officers to respond to planning casework, as well as holding seminars and running a internationally refereed journal. I'm also chairman of the National Trust Parks and Gardens Advisory Panel. All these things are voluntary, but tremendously exciting, and I just use it as a good way to get around the country and see places I haven't seen before. I have worked on over 50 historic parks and gardens in my time, a lot of them grade 1, and it was a real pleasure to be asked to come and engage with you today, so that's all I'm going to say now.
Great.
Ta-da.
Thank you, Dominic. Now, you can see we have different directions coming at the same animal, so to speak, on each of the 4 of our panelists. Now, I suppose we can start off by pointing out that I'm the one that doesn't belong in the room. Being an American, when I come over here, the presumption is that you have this amazing wealth. It's all been perfectly understood and cataloged and displayed for the visitor. But the fact is that, you know, with the wealth that you are managing, come remarkable challenges to the professionals that have been hired to, in some cases, bring up historic property into a proper new use, or to the historian and the preservationists that are just trying to maintain a publicly held sort of national trust property. There are regulatory challenges. There's sort of dynamic issues within the fact that different clients are demanding different things. I'd like to start off with a reaction to what we've heard, looking for my first question. One is location, location, location. What about each of these that we've seen? Kate's projects are that she presented are using their location to the best of their ability. In the case of Claremont, it was pointed out as perhaps a difficult thing. The fact that it's putting a challenge to us that doesn't exist in Cornwall. The Greenbelt, for instance. What happens when a government policy lays itself down on top of a property? Does anybody have a comment about the sort of the regulatory environment and how that is currently being managed or offered? Again, I have the advantage of being from America. I'm not supposed to know any of this. So, how are we doing really? Has the world become easier, harder? Chris, what do you think?
You're putting me on the spot, obviously. I think that the regulatory environment is something which in itself is evolving. Up to a point, probably 3 or 4 years ago, the regulatory environment was getting tougher. It was getting more defined, more clearly defined, and more exacting, I think. So each year that you were working on projects as a professional, then I think the sort of hoops that you were being expected to jump through became ever smaller or ever higher. And I think that also applies to developers. So development generally, was becoming more and more constrained. I'm not saying that was necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. I'm not really sort of wanting to sort of delve into the politics, but certainly I think the process itself was becoming very well defined, but also I think the specifics of that process were becoming increasingly exacting. The government have inevitably sort of freed that up somewhat. Again, I'm not sort of going to pass judgment on that, but the national planning policy framework that came out 2 years ago and is continuing to evolve in itself is putting a slightly different spin on what the constraints or the situation is with development. and it'll be interesting to see where that continues to go over the next few years. I think most people would argue that the constraints will continue to open up opportunities. So we still have a very sort of tightly controlled regulatory framework. I think it has sort of slackened off in the last few years, but I think there are still, fairly sort of strong structures that we have to work within.
Dominic, you're particularly involved in that with the Garden History Society. What's been some of your, what's your current point of view toward
Well,
regulation?
this is personal. I mean, I am here on behalf of the Garden History Society, but as I said, I can't do rules or instructions. So the entire regulatory system is a mystery to me. I can't stand it. But what's important is that we understand the significance and the beauty of the landscapes that we're looking after. So for me, it's actually much more about an individual understanding of loosely of sustainability, which is part of the topic, which I've always described as common sense and good housekeeping. And if you are going to be put in charge of managing or understanding an historic landscape and property, then you should jolly well understand it, and you don't need a rule book to do that. In fact, the rule book is, to me, an utter distraction. The National Planning Policy Framework, if you come from the planning perspective, and if you're coming from Garden History Society perspective, the fact that it's now looser means that that these landscapes are now in jeopardy because you can come and build houses on top of them without any let or hindrance. So we've kind of lost sight of a common sense approach. That's all I would say.
Kate, how have you engaged the regulatory
Hoping
world?
that you weren't going to ask me that, because I'm rather like Dominic. I don't do kind of planning jargon, and it's not something that is something that I have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, fortunately.
One of the things when we were talking together earlier was the continuity that management has to have. To do any long-term projections, the idea it would be that the rules aren't going to change in the middle of the project, or in your tenancy, your use of the property. And yet we're finding policies changing, but also personnel changing. When we were talking, you were saying that we're having, again, I have this advantage of being from America. I don't know. But the regulatory process being now devolved to hundreds of counties or mini counties.
That's a reference to the volunteer end of it. So you've got the Garden History Society, and then the County Gardens Trusts, whose umbrella organisation is the Association of Gardens Trusts. So just on the voluntary end of it, that's potentially a distraction, because each one of those County Gardens Trusts is an individual charity, and they can decide what they want to do or not do or whatever. But from the regulatory point of view, I'm senile enough, or just long enough in the tooth, to have experienced numerous changes in the way that government thinks about and funds historic parks and gardens. So originally, actually, English Heritage used to give out grants. It was then moved to, can't remember, the Countryside Agency, and now we've got Natural England funding, who we think of looking after bunnies and ducks and bugs and things. But actually, they're funding, these historic buildings that Kate's been working on. And to me, it's like utterly confusing. But if the money's there, go for it. So there isn't any clarity or certainty in the regulatory system. And the people at Natural England who are they're case officers for these kind of funded works, they have absolutely no clue about historic parks and gardens. They don't understand them. There are numbers. There's N7, which is a footpath. There's N6, which is a wellhead. And so there isn't a visceral and the passion that we have as volunteers to actually understand these places. That doesn't exist.
I think that there are a couple of points to pick up from there. I think that Dominic's right about Natural England. It is a kind of a lot of the funding, almost all the funding that's going into restoring historic landscapes at the moment is coming from Natural England under higher level stewardship schemes. And again, it comes back to this kind of word personality. I think there are some really good advisors, and I think there are some really bad advisors. I mean, most of the advisors are people who probably have an ecology background. It's terribly bureaucratic. You've got to have the mindset to deal with that bureaucracy. You've got to be a bit of a bureaucrat yourself, even if you train as an ecologist. Natural England do have historic environment officers, but they're and they're all archaeologists, I think, by training, and they're pretty few and far between. I don't think I've ever seen a Natural England person at a Garden History Society event, for example. And so Dominic clearly agrees with me. I find that a bit worrying. I'd like to think that they were members of the Garden History Society and they read their journal and their newsletter, but I suspect they don't. But from my slightly naive point of view about on the subject of regulation and landscape, the thing that I think is really worrying is that there is no statutory protection for historic landscapes as there is for listed buildings. And I think that, and we don't have that in this country, and I think that that's the place that historic landscapes are vulnerable.
To go on to it, we could spend the rest of the afternoon on regulation. It'd be very boring and frustrating at the same time. I know what that feels like from my point of view. In the States, we can create a lot of frustrating situations ourselves over there. So it's not unique. It's perhaps typical of the age where in the early 21st century now, what was established as good and right at the end of the 19th century and then carried on through the 20th with some great individual efforts in terms of garden history and preservation has now sort of fractured generally, perhaps, and we'll pick this topic up perhaps some more about the fact that there may not be an organizing principle that we can all agree on, or an organized we can go back to international bodies that might be trying to do the same thing and see if we have some common ground. On another point, though, another tack, so we're not getting so frustrated with the regulators, which we all love and appreciate. To speak to another issue of how things historic are being presented to the general public. And I'm thinking, would somebody recognize how elegantly a new development has been, designed into an historic fabric? What is it about good design that people generally feel and react to and respond to? How are we presenting our interest in history and historic properties and historic landscapes to the general public? How many opportunities are there? We have projects that are out there privately held and presented for weddings. We have projects that are properties that the National Trust have that you simply show your card at the door and enjoy. But are we reaching the next generation? Are we being presented in a way that anybody would recognize that's my children's age? Is a question. And the answer may be, heck no, we don't know, but how can we think about sharing our interest in historic properties with the next generation? That's my next question. Or with the general public. Let's think not just generationally, but somebody walking into a new project that has been carefully brought into a historic fabric, would they understand that? And can they appreciate it? Yes.
My take on this is that if our generation or whatever who's looking after and presenting these places are excited, understand the place, and allow people to experience that place, and that is the most basic, that we're excited about it. And the one thing that terrifies me if I go to a property and people know who I am is they want to tell me all about it, and they want to. Usually the most deadly bit, and I apologise for this, is being given to the head gardener. Because if you're an estate, let's say you're a big property developer, you've taken on an estate like this, and you hear that Dominic Cole, landscape architect, landscape comes out, garden history study, garden. Okay, he can be shown around by the head gardener, which is an utterly pointless exercise because I don't actually have anything to learn from the head gardener, and you can't have the discussion with the actual person. The equivalent of your bursar or whatever, who is actually in charge of that property. So there's a misunderstanding still. Everybody thinks that garden history is related to gardening, and obviously everyone can garden, and as soon as it gets sunny just before Easter, everyone can go down to B&Q and buy their garden off the shelf and go and stick it in, and that's obviously what we do and spend our lives doing. There is such a low level of understanding, which to some extent must be our fault. We are not putting across. And when you say, how does somebody, how would somebody respond to the elegance of a new development in the historic landscape? Half of them haven't even got a clue that you are in the historic landscape. And particularly, actually, sadly, the historic environment officers from Natural England, you tell them this is a park, and they go, no, this is on the Phase 1 ecological survey as natural chalk grassland. And you go, yeah, I get that. Actually, it's been designed, it's been made by somebody to look like something. So they might get the house, they might get the garden around the house, they would certainly get the tea room and where to go for a pee, because that's what most people want to do when they go to a historic park. But they will not understand that the historic park originally had a context. And certainly there's a huge issue for me. I mean, I agree with Kate that statutory status may help, but actually apart from that, this horrible business in planning of putting a line around something, as soon as you put a line round the extent of historic design landscape, whether it be Stowe, whether it be Claremont, actually outside that red line, you can do what you like. You can build a wind farm, you can build a sewage plant, you can build lots of little boxes, because it's not in the historic park. And as landscape architects, I hope that, Chris and I had I always felt we had a very good broad training, and I'm definitely not an historian. I've embraced history and I've got to learn about it, but I can't sort of do any research or anything like that. But what I can do is understand why it's exciting and important. But that's in the context of all the other things. And there's a balance, sorry I'm droning on, but there's a balance between understanding a Grade 1 historic park and understanding the ecology within it. What, for instance, the RSPB have been incredibly clever about is having fluffy things that people get excited about, so people throw money at the RSPB, and they can argue in Parliament and say this is terribly important for the birds on this site. And therefore it's more important than you can't suddenly reopen an avenue because you're going to be destroying someone's habitat. Actually, landscape doesn't work like that. It's all about management, and it's a longer-term thing than that. And there needs to be a broad understanding of everything that's going on within it, not just the one. It's not just about ecology. It's not just about productive landscape. It's not just about the design landscape. And I embrace understanding the habitat because I believe that by opening up these very often overgrown historic landscapes, we're actually re-diversifying the habitat. Because essentially, a lot of them are just woodland and grass, whereas actually they were much more diverse. When you had avenues and when you had lakes and blah blah blah, they were much more diverse, and they've become, in their sort of ideal ecology state of just letting them just now revert to some kind of weird naturalistic state that is complete fake anyway. Sorry.
Can somebody speak to that? Oh, Mike.
I agree with what Dominic says. I think we have a duty to communicate our enthusiasm, to actually it's very difficult as a professional, because you're focused on your work, to actually communicate that outside of a small group. And very often the small group you're dealing with is yourselves and the regulators, the planners. And funnily enough, I think that relationship has got better. It's got more collaborative. There's more of a shared understanding. If you're in the right place, some places it's terrible. I would say that a lot of the conservation bodies have come about because of a threat. The SPAB came about because of George Gilbert Scott's work to a cathedral that was upset William Morris. The National Trust also was seeking to save something, and so on and so on. But I think there's also, there must be a limited constituents, I would say, of people that are really bothered or interested. It's a demographic, in the same way that there's a lot of things I probably wouldn't be interested in. New York rap artists or something like that, I just wouldn't be interested however good they were. So I think the importance of communication, I think a lot more of that is possible. Everyone's got access to much more information much more quickly than they ever have in the past. But we're competing against other things, other forms of entertainment, and
I've got a number of points here from what Dominic was saying. First of all, I agree with something that Dominic was saying, that I think, in my experience, the ecology and the heritage goes hand in hand very often. What you want to do to make the environment better for the wildlife is actually also restoring historic management techniques. So I think that that's less of a conflict than one might think sometimes. I want to defend gardeners as well, because I actually think, in my experience, head gardeners are actually usually pretty knowledgeable people, and they know about more than just plants. And I think, not necessarily being a head gardener, but somebody who has lived and worked on a site for a long time, I think that they have an incredible wealth of knowledge usually. And it's more than just a wealth of knowledge. They have a sympathy for the landscape. And time and time again, I've met people who just have such a sort of feeling for the place that they're working in. The other thing that I think Dominic touched on that I think is really, really important, and again, that sort of comes back to the planning framework and regulation and stuff, is the landscape context of these things. You can't just draw a line around a historic landscape. I mean, this is one of the big problems, I think, with the way that English heritage have to draw their boundaries for parks and gardens, that you have a green line around the edge, and everything inside is designed and everything outside isn't. And actually, it doesn't take any account of any vistas out and vistas in and that sort of thing. And somewhere like Croom, for example, great capability brown landscape in the Severn Valley, it has borrowed views for miles and miles and miles to the Malvern Hills, to Breeden Hill, back to Broadway the other way. And how can you protect a landscape that has such an enormous landscape context? You can't stop a farmer putting up a great agricultural barn with a big shiny roof right in the middle of your view, and that's a vulnerability, I think.
It's interesting that I understood that Brown was doing that in his designs, but the more famous are the Japanese gardens that are designed on a postage stamp but go to the horizon in their design.
Well, just look out the window. I mean, the fact is,
yeah, we have power lines.
Brown moved this house. I mean, the house before that predated Clive and Brown was down the hill, and was very much, set to be on low-lying ground. I mean, he moved the house here to get the vantage point, and you can look out to Windsor to the west, and you can look out to the Surrey Hills in the east. So, I mean, he was very much sort of about exploiting the topography and the vantage point. The Belvedere, again, go up to the top of the Belvedere, that is the classic outlook. So it looks right into the City of London. So, they were all playing exactly the same games. But just to go back to your original question was, how do we enthuse the sort of next generation, and how do we sort of disseminate what's good about these places to people? And in a way, I think there's a bit of a dilemma there, or a conundrum, in that I think we're already engaged. I mean, if you look at most people who live within a 10-mile radius of here, most of them will have been to Claremont and come here on a regular basis. And similarly, most of the sort of country parks, I think wherever you're living, they're always seen as an opportunity to go out on a Sunday afternoon and have a stroll and a cup of tea. I'm a family man like everybody else. I brought my family here. I mean, do my children have, well, they're not children anymore, but have they understood what it is that's special about these places? Probably not. But they've still been here, they've still experienced it, and then there is the opportunity for them to understand it at some point in their lives. I think the issue here is that if we don't protect these landscapes, if they're not sustainable, if they disappear, if they continue to become over mature and decline, then the resource isn't there. And so we have to ensure that they are protected, so that for the next generation they can actually experience these places and come out on a Sunday afternoon and enjoy them. If it is a very sort of superficial experience, well, so be it. But I think it's still better to have a superficial experience than no experience at all. When our kids were quite young, we always took the view, whenever we went on a holiday, we would go to art galleries, and our view was that the kids had to go in. If it was only for half an hour, they would go in. So we did the FITSI in half an hour. And it was great when the boys went back to school, because first term back, somebody stood up and said, "Do you know what this painting is?" And I think it was either Venus rising out of the shell, or it was the Bishop of Urbino, one of the two, and he did. So that was obviously paid off. So I think it's better if people have even a minuscule amount of understanding of these issues than no understanding at all.
May I say something else about children, because that's something I have a lot of experience because I have small children at the moment, but also I'm really passionate about, and I think it sort of builds on what you were saying. I think if you take children out into design landscapes and you give them a positive experience, then they learn to love that place, and then the appreciation and everything will come later. But I'm also a great fan of horrible histories on television. If you haven't seen it, we'll send you some links. My 7-year-old can tell you who Charles II was. He was the king who loved to party, because he knows him from horrible histories. You then take him to Ham House and you show him a landscape of that date, and suddenly lots of pieces of context come together, and he has a greater appreciation of it. And I think we're really lucky. I think that there is a much greater appreciation of history for children now than there was when I was at that age. And I also think that living history has done a lot for that. You go to a reenactment somewhere. Again, my children absolutely adore going to Arundel Castle when there are guys dressed up as knights. It just brings it to life for them. And Kentwell in Suffolk as well, for their Tudor weekends, we go and we speak very bad Tudor English, and we go to the ale house and we have our hot coffins for lunch. And they just adore that. And if that gives them a passion for history, and they also have appreciation for landscape, then I'm relatively optimistic that generation will be the guardians of the future.
We're not going to solve any of these problems today, but I do appreciate that by having the artifact, by having it there to experience, we at least have an opportunity to carry on, and as you said, they will learn to love it, and then they will be curious enough to find out why, and why they enjoyed it as much as they did. Yes, Chris?
I mean, I think the sort of high point of gardening is long gone and will probably never be rediscovered. I mean, if you take what was happening, started in the 1700s in garden design, people were doing things in gardens because they were it was one-upmanship, basically. And so you had to acquire the newest import, the newest sort of plant that come from the west coast of America or Southeast Asia. And it was almost the sort of same as people going out and buying a new iPhone now, but you had to have the sort of latest commodity, and at that time gardening was it. Will we ever get back to that stage? Probably not. Almost certainly not. But I still think for garden designers that was the sort of zenith really, and we should sort of celebrate that.
I would like to open up the conversation to the audience as with some question and answers. I have a roving microphone. And have we prompted any questions? If so, great. Put your hand up. Argue. Point out that no, what we've just heard is incorrect, and in fact, I know better. I'd like to hear that. But as again, from my point of view, and I think I might be at an advantage as being as naive as I am and coming from such a young country. I've been working for 14 years on a garden that was created in 1892, and we thought that was old. You are standing, in one of the most significant landscapes in the country. And my presumption was, well, of course, everybody understands that, but clearly there's work to be done. If we had several more lifetimes, we could be working on this together for quite a while to assure that the new technologies that we have, the websites that are available, the different ways of sharing information could be used. One of the, when I hear about regulatory issues, the facts that could be used to determine a regulatory question should be readily available online. There should be a database with information that is well vetted and understood. But I think for today, if we have no questions and we have an opportunity to open up to the panel, if you something that you wanted to bring forward, otherwise, I'm open for questions. R for T.
Oh, can I just make one
Yes.
comment?
No, that's.
It seems to me that one of the things you've got very heavily against you are the people who wish to build anywhere they can build something, because that's the sort of society we're in, and they have a lot of power. I think also the technology, yes, it's good on one side, but I think on another side there are a lot of young people who will happily look at historic buildings on their iPhone. You've got to get them out there. And in fact, I'm going to Kenwood only because I was waylaid on, I think it was Euston Station, by a group of young people who dressed me up in a wig and a hat and gave me a fan, and I had my photograph taken in a photo frame. And they said, "We've just redone Kenwood, come along and see the real thing." And I'm going because the weather's getting better. But I do think there's an awful lot against you. I mean, we both have allotments. Eric Pickles wants to sell off the allotment land because they want to build, because there's money in it. And I think you've actually, unfortunately, got a big fight.
Anyone else? Yes.
Sorry. Just to take a little issue with Dominic, I'm not a head gardener, I'm an assistant head gardener in a historic landscape. And for the last 14 years I've been doing the research on the history of that estate because nobody else had done it. It happens that history is the thing that interests me as well as gardening. Not all gardeners are unlucky that way. But I think Kate's comment that head gardeners actually do have a feeling for their estates is very valid. I do understand where Dominic was coming from, that the worst thing you want is for a head gardener to be banging on about what he plans to do with the estate. That actually has got nothing to do with the sort of plans that and designs and concerns that you have. But I would certainly suggest that most head gardeners and even, dare I say it, their staff, because head gardeners get a pretty good press. people tend to forget that there's hundreds and hundreds of the rest of us actually doing the work. And most of those also have a passion for where they're working and very often know a great deal about it. I went to a historic Gardens Day up in Shropshire, and the best speaker we had actually was the head gardener at the place, because he knew more about it than almost anybody else. So the head gardeners can give you a lot, but obviously you're being brought in for the skills that you have that the people on the team don't have, and so you can work together and get there. But we have terrible problems with people wanting to build things in where I work, purely because they didn't understand the layout of the estate and the historical significance. They've put a building across one of the major sight lines. They could have moved it 30 yards south and the building would still be there and the historic view line would still be there. But because they built it where they built it, we've lost it until we managed to knock it down again. So a combination of planning and knowledge is essential. I don't know if that gets us anywhere.
Very quickly respond, which is, you might have noticed I was just stirring a bit. I'm actually a fellow of the Institute of Horticulture, and one of the things that I've brought online with the Garden History Society is to offer lectures to colleges of horticulture, because it is the gardeners who are going to be actually in the front line of looking after these places. So I'm actually a very passionate advocate of looking after gardeners. I was just winding you all up.
I just had a comment really on historic landscapes and maintenance of them. Seems to be two issues to me, finance and planning. I wondered if the panel had comments on the introduction of new land uses in trying to finance restoration or maintenance of historic landscapes.
I should respond to that one. I mean, I think in a way this is the sort of elephant in the room, that quite often those landscapes which aren't in the sort of upper echelons, and that includes Claremont. You know, it's not Stowe, it's not Chatsworth, but it's still a Grade 1 landscape. You know, how does it fund its maintenance and its management? Because obviously that's quite a burden for whoever is owning the estate. And if the sort of occupant of the estate is needing to sort of generate income to survive, which obviously Claremont School is, then it needs to do so in a manner where its facilities are up to date. And you know, this is often the dilemma that one has, that you are trying to generate or trying to give yourself the resources to deliver whatever services you're offering. If it's a school, then obviously you need contemporary buildings to do so. How do you do that within the historic environment? And quite often, restoration, management, maintenance of a landscape resource and of the building fabric obviously has to be done alongside running something which is a viable proposition. So I don't think it's any great secret that Claremont at the moment has an application in for new buildings, and that's being considered, and that very much has to be considered alongside the sort of benefits that would come with a restored landscape, or certainly a greater level of management within the landscape than they've been able to deliver so far.
Well, Chris, I would question whether a new contribution necessarily causes harm. It can be improve something. I don't think it's always the case that what's coming along afterwards, because as you explained with the history of Claremont, there's been various hands at work over history, and I think we have to an extent a right to make a contribution, but I think the critical thing is that it's an informed contribution.
Yeah, sure. No, I wasn't for a minute suggesting that development was all negative. I was just saying that whenever development is taking place, then quite often, or whenever landscape maintenance needs to be delivered, then if there is development associated with it, then they do have to go sort of hand in glove.
Yeah,
I mean,
I
at
think
the end of the
it's-
day, if no one is resident within the site, then no one's carrying out any maintenance, and so within a very short time frame, the whole thing is lost. So sustainability is only sustainable so long as you have somebody resident, and quite often, they have to earn an income to be resident.
It's the balance between
Right.
enabling development and harming the special interest of the asset. I mean, I think that's the difficult side of things.
Could I just put a positive spin, which I understand that builders and developers are a threat to historic parks and gardens, but if you think about the last, whatever it is, 10 years of the Heritage Lottery Fund, that's millions and millions of pounds. It's getting on for between 15 and 20 million now that have actually been poured into historic landscapes, which is totally new. We've never had that amount of money before. Local authorities also have Section 106 money that if you have got a development, they can actually take that, and you've also got landfill tax. So rather than saying, ooh, these places are jolly expensive to maintain, actually, if you're canny with the money and the management and you actually understand what's available, there are things that you can do. I worked on Alexandra Palace 12 years ago with a grant of 3.2 million from the Heritage Lottery Fund, which I thought was enormous. It's huge, but of course it is it's 270 acres that we had to use it across, and there were roads and buildings and blah, blah, blah. Last week I went for a meeting with the architects who are just working on the East Wing, which is where the old BBC studios were, and there's a wonderful music hall theatre. And they said, we've only got 15 million. So it's kind of relative, really.
I think the problem is, though, Dominic, as you know, that HLF funding implies that you are providing public access, and schools, for very good reasons, can't do that. So the HLF isn't really open to them as an option.
What about the school holidays? Stowe
Stowe's
took money.
Brilliant candidate, or brilliant example. Well, they've had a lot.
Stowe's open 365 days of the year. I mean, there are
But the house.
No, the house, but the park.
But the house has had a HLF grant.
Yep.
And I think the point about Stowe is that they have had to accept, the school had to accept that they were in this amazing heritage asset. Yes, they got rid of the gardens to the National Trust, but they had a Grade 1 house, and people wanted to see it, people were interested, people wanted to see the entity. They wanted to be able to enter the gardens through the house and see the two things in the context of each other. It took I was working at Stowe at the time, and it took an awful lot of negotiation with the Heritage Lottery Fund. But by some very cunning legal means, the school set up the Stowe House Preservation Trust, and they have their own staff. It's open to the public on a regular basis. And the restoration that has been done to the house is absolutely stunning. I think it's been a great success.
The school have actually had to accept a long-term master plan where land uses and building uses have actually had to move out from the core, which was not the case really when you were working there. They were entrenched, but since then they've realised what a fantastic opportunity that is.
I think there's been a huge culture shift at the school, and I think in the phase immediately after the trust took over the gardens, there was a real them and us, but it's come a long way. And again, it comes back to the personality thing as well. If you get the right people who are happy to listen to each other and to compromise, then you can start to achieve things. And I think it has been a great success. But what Dominic was saying about master planning, I think, is also very important on these sites. And going back to what the gentleman, the wonderful gardener over there, was saying about development in historic landscapes and not understanding the history and then just plonking buildings down. If you understand the history, understand how something evolved, and you respect boundaries and footprints and things, you get a better result in the end. And that's what sort of master planning for development within historic landscapes can really help with. And you can tell, I've been to quite a lot of other places in institutional use, you can tell where there has been a good plan underlying things, because it respects areas. We can't be too precious. We want these landscapes to be sustainable. We want schools to use these buildings. So we've got to be realistic, I think.
On that note, we may decide to carry on for another hour and give everybody a break and a stand up, or we can, do we actually have some refreshments?
We do.
We do? Okay. Okay. Thank you so much for coming, for taking part in this conversation. It's a conversation that we intend to carry on, and we would like you all to feel part of it, but also contribute as you have to sort of push the experts into positions that they know that are being communicated to the general public in reasonable and clear terms. And I think if we keep talking to each other, we'll finally start having some common ground, some common terms, and get on with this. And I'm so grateful for all four of you to come today. I know the school is. I know that this is the beginning of something, and we're not going to call it just the end for today, but to the beginning. And I appreciate you all coming. Thank you so much. Please we have the house open, don't we? We have at least a cup of tea waiting for you, and we get to walk into the, we'll go find out where that is. Okay. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.